and begin. So the Library of Alexandria. So this is going to be not just about the library itself, but a lot of historical context and some of the influences of the library and the books that were in the library and the people who studied there. So its origins go back to Alexander the Great, who named this city after himself, along with about 20 other cities. He was in his 20s and early 30s before he died. In his early 30s, he went east from northern Greece and conquered most of the known world east of Greece, including Egypt at the time. And this is a map of what he conquered, starting from Greece up here. He first came down to the Middle East and went into Egypt, and then he went all the way across right out to the borders to modern day India, basically. And this whole region was under his control. When he died, very, very young, at the age of 33 or so, 3 of his generals took command of this empire. And the one we'll be focusing on are the Ptolemies down here in Egypt. That's P.T. Ptolemy. So yes, originally he was a general of Alexander, and he took Alexander's body back from, I think it was Babylon where he died, to Alexandria, which you can see here, which was this new city under Alexander. One of the huge effects of this empire was Greek-speaking people conquering this land and assuming power in these different regions. And along with the Greek language, they also brought in Greek culture. They put the stamp of Greek culture, Greek learning, Greek philosophy, Greek science, Greek pleasure and religion onto these places. But they also incorporated the native cultures. So it wasn't just completely destroying the native cultures, they syncretized them together. And this is what we call Hellenism. So this starts in 330 BC, roughly, when Alexander dies. And this goes all the way through for the next 300 or 400 years of Hellenization. Hellene was another word for ancient Greece. And it's within this context of this new Greek culture and the Greek spirit, if you like, dragged into these places that arises Alexandria and the library that comes out of this city. This land of Egypt was very, very wealthy. It was famed, one of the only places in the world at the time where the papyrus plant grew, which is how they then made paper, which was the way that books were made. They didn't have sort of vellum, so calf skins or parchment. They had papyrus, which was the thing that you wrote on at the time. So Egypt had a monopoly on paper, basically, which was incredibly expensive for other countries to buy from Egypt. And also grain. Huge flood systems along the river Nile, allowing all of these crops to grow, especially grains. And they were then exported all over the Mediterranean and brought in huge wealth to this new dynasty called the Ptolemies. So this is the old city of Alexandria in black, overlaid onto the modern-ish city. This is an older drawing, but it was laid out in a grid fashion, very organized grid fashion, a bit like an army camp. And this was the ancient city of Alexandria, set up by Alexander the Great. This is an aerial view from today. So you can still see this natural harbor formation. So there are 2 harbors, and it's right onto the front of the Mediterranean. It's got a huge, in ancient history, it had a huge lake behind it, which is now just marshland. So all of the produce from Africa, the gold and ivory and precious stones and this kind of thing, could be brought up and then shipped up this lake to Alexandria. So this is an artist's depiction of the beginnings of the city. And another view here when it's more developed with very Greek classical buildings and this natural harbor. And this little island here called Pharos Island, which is where in the reign of the first three Ptolemies, so in the 200s BC, roughly at the same time as the library was built, they built the Great Alexandria, the lighthouse at Alexandria, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And in today's Alexandria, there's just this 500-year-old fort in its place. So the Ptolemies, with their Greek history, they were very interested in knowledge and in learning. So Ptolemy I, he was the general of Alexander who took over this area. And you can see this joining of the Egyptian culture and the Greek culture, where from Alexandria, you find very Greek statues of Ptolemy, but you also find these Egyptianized versions. So they tried to include this ancient Egyptian culture into this new Greek ruling power. So much so that one of the gods, for example, was a mix of Osiris, who was the Greek god of the underworld, and Apis, who was again an underworld god in Greece. And from this Osiris Apis came Serapis, who was a Greco-Egyptian god, who part of the library was actually named after him, the Serapeum, which we'll get to later. So Aristotle, he was actually the tutor to Alexander the Great when Alexander the Great was young. Aristotle was very interested in knowledge, in finding out the causes of things. In finding out the causes of things, you can know it. You can know how the world works. So this aspect of knowledge, culture, learning was really, really, really important to Aristotle and to the Greek philosophers. And it seems quite likely that this passed on through Alexander into the cities that he brought up and founded, and potentially even an inspiration for the library itself. No one really knows exactly what the influence for the library was, whether it was just Ptolemy's idea, whether it was inspired by Aristotle or inspired by other philosophers at the time. But it seems quite likely that a large part of this was from Aristotle. He's also one of the first recorded men to have a private book collection, so emphasizing the importance of this learning material nearby. I'll get back to this painting later, but this is the famous School of Athens by Raphael in the Vatican. And here's Aristotle in dialogue with Plato. And this is actually a very Greek painting. All of the figures in the painting are actually Greek, most of them anyway. And the label above it is causarum cognitio, so the knowledge of the causes. And in the Renaissance, and also before that in the medieval world, Christianity often really liked Aristotle because in his time, he was pagan, worshipping different gods, but he wanted to know the cause of the universe, the causes of things that he could see around him. And in the same way, the Christians felt that if you could know how the universe works in a mathematical way, that you could work it out, then you could tap into the mind of God himself. So you start to see some of the lineages that come through from the ancient Greek world, and a lot of the writings that survived from these writers was copied in the Library of Alexandria and could then pass on to the future. Yeah. So in this area in the north of the city was called the Brucrium, and this was the royal area. And there are a couple of comments from old Roman writers that the Library of Alexandria was somewhere up in this northern section, the royal section of the city. No one knows what it looked like, and no one knows exactly where it is even today. So they think they know roughly in this area, but no remains have been found. It's pretty mysterious. But this is just a rough artist depiction of how the library may have looked. So again, it's not clear exactly when it was built, but around 300 or 290 BC, under the rule either of Ptolemy I or his son Ptolemy II, it seems to have been up and running. it wasn't actually a building in itself. It wasn't built as the Library of Alexandria. It was built as part of a complex called the Museon. The Museon was any building or community that was built up, inspired, dedicated to the 9 muses, who's this Greek mythology, the inspiration for art and science and astronomy, astrology, poetry, the arts and the sciences. The muses were really important. These were these semi-divine figures that would inspire men to be able to do great things. So this word museon was this place where the arts and sciences could flourish. It wasn't a museum in the modern sense where you actually have objects on display that you go and look at. It was a center of learning and study and teaching. And that is where we get the word museum from. It's a place to the muses, but the original function was quite different. And connected to the Museon was the Library of Alexandria. Here are again the nine muses. So yes, this is roughly where the library was. And there was a huge inspiration and a drive from the Ptolemies to acquire as many books as possible from all over the world for this library. So today, in today's world, the biggest libraries are, I believe, the British Library and the Library of Congress in the States, which between them, well, I think they have about 170 million to 200 million books in each. So a huge amount of books from all over the world. But they do not have every single book ever, because that's loads and loads of books. But the Library of Alexandria in the Ptolemies' time, they wanted to have as many books as possible, everything, if possible, throughout the whole world, the whole knowledge of the whole world in one. Part of this drive was probably because of this Greek influence of learning. But another aspect was a cultural prestige. There were other libraries in the world at that time. They were smaller than what Alexandria became, but they were often the neighbors, the enemies, or the peers of the Ptolemies. So it was kind of like a cultural one-upmanship. And it worked. The Library of Alexandria, from its growing body of scrolls and books and texts, it drew scholars from all over the world at the time to come and study there. You need to have political stability for a library to work in the ancient world, especially. You need to have interest from up on high, so good funding. And yeah, those are the main things: funding, interest, and political stability, which Egypt in the time of the Ptolemies had for a few hundred years. It had this stability, funding, and interest. And so the whole thing blossomed enormously. And the scholars who would come and research and teach there, they were paid to be there. They didn't have to pay taxes. They got good accommodation. They were treated well. So it was a really unique time in history, and just a really unique institution to have arisen 2,300 years ago. Where they think the library was today, roughly, is the modern Library of Alexandria, which is probably very different looking than how it was 2,500 years ago. So yes, collecting scrolls. They were often, the Ptolemies, these kings, they were often very ruthless in how they got these scrolls. There was one law that was made where every ship arriving in the harbor of Alexandria had to be searched, and all of the books that were taken from these ships would be taken to the library, copied, and then the people would get the copies back and the originals would stay in the library. So this is what the books would have looked like at the time: bits of wood with paper, papyrus wrapped around them. And again here, there's also another story, or it's written down as history, that the Ptolemies, they wrote to Athens because they wanted to have a collection of Greek tragedies. They really wanted these Greek tragedies. And Athens said, no, they're far too precious for us to send them to be copied. And so the Ptolemies said, okay, we'll pay you just this crazy amount of money. And Athens finally said, okay. So they sent these manuscripts to Alexandria. Alexandria then copied them and kept the originals and gave them, Athens, the copies. These things were so valuable, the priority was so high to have these originals, that Alexandria, the Ptolemies, just left this huge amount of money that they had given to the Athenians, and they kept the scrolls. Pretty amazing. And there was a big scriptorium. So a huge part of the work was bringing in these texts and then copying them. So there would have been scribes who were copying these texts, working in this library. The library got so big that they actually had to build a separate, like a sister library. So no one knows exactly how many books there actually were in there. The estimates vary from 40,000 all the way up to 500,000 texts. But it was certainly, within quite a short period of time, became the biggest library in the world and attracted great minds to go there. So yes, it got so big that under the reign of Ptolemy III, he built another institution called the Serapeum, which was dedicated to this Greco-Egyptian god. And the remains of the Serapeum do still survive. They're not very close to the Library of Alexandria, but there were also many scrolls stored in the Serapeum. So one of the earliest mentions of someone involved in the library and involved in the formation of the library was this guy called Philitas of Coss. And he was the tutor to Ptolemy II. It seems quite a powerful argument that Philitas would have had some kind of influence of the library being built, given that it was probably built under the reign of Ptolemy II. So Philitas was the first mentioned person to be a scholar and a poet and a critic. So he actually he read Homer, and he made a glossary at the end of these Homeric texts for all of the words that were difficult or rare words, so that if you looked at a word you didn't know, you could turn to the back and you could read one of his notes about what the word meant. So it's this little arising in the Western world of scholarship, of having the space and time to actually be able to edit, to research, to write one's own books. Pretty amazing. The first head librarian of the library, who would have probably answered to the Ptolemies, the kings who would have overseen the library and the collections, he would have been in charge of the scribes, and Zenodotus, who is the first mentioned librarian, also was heavily involved in organizing all of these texts. You can see in this image these little labels on the end of these scrolls. So he made this system of alphabetizing all of the books, which is the first recorded mention of a librarian and someone who is actually alphabetizing the books. He also made different ways of organizing the books. With these little labels, they had information about what was in the scroll, so that if you were a scholar visiting there, then you wouldn't have to unroll each of the scrolls to see what was inside. You could just read the label until you found the right thing. And he was also a scholar of Homer, actually editing it and commenting on these works. One of the most famous poets from the ancient Greek world, Hellenistic poets, was Callimachus. And he was not the head librarian, but he was very much involved in the Library of Alexandria. Many of these people, they came from abroad to Alexandria. They weren't all born there. And Callimachus, again, further organized the books, but he wrote a huge book called the Pinakes, which just means the labels, which was a compendium of all of Greek literature up until that time. It was, in a way, the first kind of encyclopedia, but just for literary works, for books. And this was really, really important because this was a way of categorizing books to a whole new level under different labels like epic or poetry, science, elegies. And this is something that's still done today when we organize books by genre. So Callimachus was the first recorded person to do this in this allowing environment of the Library of Alexandria. He was a different kind of poet than before. He didn't like big books. There's a quote by him saying, "Big books, big evil." So he didn't like these waffling epics. He liked something more cultured, more witty, more sophisticated, something that could bring you in and a bit mystify you. You needed to be a bit learned to be able to get it, a bit cultured. And this was a new breed of poet that was really inspiring for the Roman poets like Propertius and Catullus. And these in turn were big influences in the Renaissance and in Victorian literature. A new breed of poetry, again, coming out in part because of this environment of the library. Part of Callimachus's ability to write these new poems was because of his learning, because of all these books that he had access to. He could access weird little folk tales or new words or different countries, tales about different kinds of people. And you could bring these into kind of different kinds of poetry. So really, really interesting. And this is just an example of one of his poems that I find really, really pretty. So I'll read the Greek and then read the English, but feel free to read the English along as I'm reading the Greek. Epeitis Herakleite, theon moron este medacru, hergagen emnetsen deosakis amphoteroi, helion lesce catadusamen, alasumen pu, zen halicarnesu, tetrapelai spodie, aide teae zousin andones, hersin hopanton harpactes aedus, uc epi heira vale. They told me, Heraclitus, they told me you were dead. They brought me bitter news to hear and bitter tears to shed. I wept as I remembered how often you and I had tired the sun with talking and sent him down the sky. And now that thou art lying, my dear old carrion guest, a handful of grey ashes long, long ago at rest, still are thy pleasant voices, thy nightingales awake. For death he taketh all away, but them he cannot take. One of the most famous mathematicians in the world, who wrote one of the most famous, influential books ever, also was a librarian at the Library of Alexandria and studied there and taught there, who was Euclid. His book, one of his books, The Elements, as you can see here from this old copy, was incredibly influential because in it, Euclid laid out both his own findings in maths, especially in geometry, how things work in space, how shapes are formed, how you can measure the angle of things. He brought together both his own understanding of these, his own research, but also the work of people before him into one document in a clear, scientific, rational way, where he would put the proposition and then do the workings and then prove it. So this was a really early example of the scientific method. This was irrefutable truth. This was how things were. The Elements was taught as the main mathematical text all the way up until the early 20th century. So for 2,300 years, this text was true, and it still is true, as in the geometry in it is accurate. Most other of the texts that survive, the ancient medicine, other ancient maths, or what's the word, astronomy. They have some pretty glaring errors in them often. But this text has, it's a universal truth, and it sort of always will be. It's science, and it's really quite incredible that this happened in the Library of Alexandria and was copied throughout the ages, and it managed to survive and was such a huge influence in Western thought, Western science, logic, the scientific method. Really incredible. Here is Euclid in the school of Athens, drawing out a geometric design. So he gets featured in this great panoply of the Greek philosophers and scientists under Raphael. His text was one of the most sought after in the ancient world by people who wanted to copy it. And we'll get into that story a bit later. But one of the earliest papyrus fragments from a town in Egypt where they discovered loads of these papyri that had been basically thrown into the rubbish. There are these ancient texts of Euclid's Elements showing these geometric patterns and prove you're working, you know, like in these old exams when you're 15, give the answer and show you're working, you know, show how you did it. This is why Euclid was so great. He was clear in showing how he got to these truths. And a quote from Isaac Newton about Euclid: "It's the glory of geometry that from so few principles it can accomplish so much." And one of the things, for me, the interesting things this geometry helped was the Renaissance, was this new attitude towards perspective. If you look at an older medieval, this is from the Bayeux Tapestry, you can tell their buildings and their people, but there's no real sense of perspective. And then you get these early works from the Renaissance. This is a work by Masaccio in Florence, which shows this new sense of perspective. And a lot of this comes from Euclid, from the Elements, from maths. Another great figure was Herophilus, who was a physician and an anatomist who came to Alexandria to study medicine. And part of him coming there was because Alexandria was one of the only places at that time where you could actually dissect bodies, human bodies. This was a taboo in the rest of the world at the time, but it was allowed in Alexandria. So Herophilus came to Alexandria and he dissected apparently hundreds and hundreds of bodies, and people would watch him do it, and he would do demonstrations, and he would research the body through anatomy, through real-time anatomy on people. And he developed knowledge about how the blood flows, that there are two different kinds, there are the arteries and the veins. He found out about the nervous system, all kinds of fascinating things that he discovered about the human body. And it only really started again, this dissecting, this anatomical research, it only really started again in earnest to discover new things in the Renaissance again, 1500 years later. It's really quite incredible. Actually, this guy Andreas Vesalius in the 1500s, this is AD, 500 years ago, he was one of the first anatomists and physicians who actually really started again to try and find out new things about the body. 1500 years after Herophilus was one of the first to actually do it. Again, at the Library of Alexandria, really amazing. I find this guy really, really interesting. I mean, they're all fascinating, and there are also loads more people connected to the library, but I've tried to choose the most kind of interesting from a wide spectrum, who was Aristarchus. And he was an astronomer and a mathematician, 300 BC, so 2,300 years ago. And he theorized that the Earth goes around the sun, that the sun is much bigger than the Earth, and the sun is a star, just like the other stars that you can see in the night sky, but they're probably much further away than our little sun, or our big sun. Pretty amazing stuff, considering that Ptolemy, who we'll get to a bit later, 300 years later, he said it's a geocentric universe. Everything goes around the Earth. And that was believed until Copernicus in the 1500s. But Aristarchus got there, got the truth 300 years before Ptolemy. And this quote here from Isaac Asimov: "It was too much for the philosophers of the time to swallow, and astronomy had to wait 2,000 years more to find the right path." I just find that so amazing that it was kind of knowledge that Aristarchus and a few others had, that the Earth goes around the sun. There are other planets, there's the sun, there are many, many other stars like the sun. Really amazing. Another librarian at the Library of Alexandria was Eratosthenes, again, well into the BC, so 2,200 years ago. And in his research in the Library of Alexandria, he came across a text that said there's a particular well a few hundred miles south of Alexandria, which you can see here mentioned as A. And this well down here, it was noted that at a certain time of the year, the sun would go right down into the bottom of this well. There was no shadow at all. So the light had gone straight down. There was no angle. And so what Eratosthenes suddenly thought is that, well, you can put up a stick in Alexandria, and then you can measure the angle of the shadow of the sun at the same time that it's going straight down into that well. So you have someone measuring it here, and you have someone measuring it here. And then with that angle, assuming that the world is round, which they assumed it was, then you can work out the circumference of the Earth. And Eratosthenes arrived at about 40,000 kilometers, which is basically what the circumference of the Earth is. He was a couple of hundred of kilometers off 2,200 years ago. Really, really amazing. He also, through these calculations of different angles from the sun's rays and from his research at the library, he also worked out the tilt of the Earth, that it is on a tilted axis. And again, to a very accurate degree. And then comes Ptolemy, who, along with Euclid and the elements, his work, the Almagest or the Almagest, was a hugely influential astronomical work. Again, one of the works that was copied and survived up until today, and was hugely influential in the medieval period up until Copernicus. So one of Ptolemy's key theories was that it's a geocentric universe, that everything revolves around the Earth. I'll get back to that in a sec. So you have the Earth at the center, and then the moon, and then the sun. No, sorry, the moon, Mercury, Venus, and then the sun, and then Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and then the firmament, all in these nice concentric circles around the Earth. And this was believed right up until Copernicus, who then said it's actually a heliocentric universe. Things go round the sun in the 1500s, in the same vein as Aristarchus. But the Almagest, so I'm going to bring in the Arabic story of these Greek texts being copied and surviving into today's world, because the Almagest is actually an Arabic word which means al-magiste, the greatest. So it was seen as a really, really, really important work and was sought after by Arabic scholars when the Greek world kind of collapsed and the Middle East became incredibly powerful. The Almagest was one of the greatest books. And these Arabic scholars and mathematicians and scientists, they combined this Greek science with their own astronomical observations and also texts from, I think it's Oh, I've got it a bit later. But they also combined Indian mathematics, which I'll get onto a bit later. Sorry for that confusion. Ptolemy also did a map of the stars and a map of the constellations and how the stars move in the sky. This was really important because many ancient people believed in the God world above being a map of the earthly world. So as above, so below. The Greeks believed in this. The early Arabs believed in this as well. So it wasn't just about the interest in astronomy, but astronomy and astrology, they were the same thing. So you could get arcane spiritual truth, and you could tell the future, you could tell the past from the movements of the heavens. Ptolemy was also a geographer. So one of his other books, aside from the Almagest, was the Geographia, which was a map of the world at the time. So this is a copy of one of Ptolemy's maps. And if you're from England, this is one of the earliest maps of England, the south here. Something like Scotland, looking really weird up here, and Hibernia being island. And the last character to look at before we go to the lasting influence of the library is Galen, who was really seen as one of the greatest ancient doctors. So this quote here, primum sane medicorum esse, philosophorum autem solum. So first among the doctors and alone among philosophers. So he was seen as really, really, really bright and influential and great. And a bit like Euclid before him, Galen collected medical knowledge from the Greek world and from other areas, which were all in the Library of Alexandria. And from his research, he was able to write many, many, many books about medicine, largely, but also about philosophy. Galen's works make up half of all Greek literature that survived up until today. It's pretty incredible. There was a whole medical course, which was just called the Galen course, where if you were trying to become a doctor in the ancient world, you would basically read Galen as one of your main influences. And again, he was very influential, and his medicine and his anatomy lasted up until the Renaissance era, when people started to actually refute some of the things he was saying. But yeah, he was incredibly influential, and again would do live anatomies on animals actually in front of people, because by this time human bodies, it was outlawed. He also was a strong proponent and developer of the four humors of the body, that depending your mood or your illness or things that have gone wrong are results of an imbalance of some of these four humors. And this, again, this lasted all the way up until the 1800s, this belief in the four humors. So Cleopatra was the last pharaoh. She was the last Egyptian ruler. She wasn't actually Egyptian, she was Greek. She was in the line of these Ptolemies. But after she committed suicide, the Romans took over control of Egypt. And the Romans actually, they weren't that interested in libraries in the sense that the Ptolemies were, in this really empowering sense of giving a huge amount of money and time to these libraries. So that's one reason why scholars and historians think that the Library of Alexandria started to kind of fade away from importance in about this time. So about 2,000 years ago. So 300 odd years after it had been founded, you start to see the first signs of it falling apart. But the library still is famous, and Alexandria itself is a famous center of learning up until about 700, 800 AD. So it has 1,000 years of being one of the most powerful centers of learning and study in the ancient world. There's one famous story that Julius Caesar burnt down the library by mistake. But that's not actually true, because there are references to the library hundreds of years after Julius Caesar was there. Part of the library's collections may have been burnt down by Caesar. There certainly was a fire, but it wasn't completely destroyed by Caesar. So that's something that I thought was the truth before actually researching this talk more. And then it turns out that it's not true at all. It seems that the more banal, boring reason is that it just slowly faded away as there were different invasions of Egypt, different cultures, different religions took over, especially the monotheistic religions like Christianity and Islam, who weren't really fans of anything that wasn't talking about their God. So there was an attack by a Christian mob in the 400s when one of the only female librarians, Hypatia, who was a famous scholar in her own right and astronomer scientist, she was dragged out and killed by this mob who distrusted this pagan center of knowledge. And it really starts to go out of history at the time of the Muslim conquering of Egypt in the 600s and 700s AD. Again, when the books that didn't agree with their beliefs, they were simply discarded or, yeah. But that's not entirely true, because the Arabs then did take on a lot of the ancient scientific texts in particular and had them copied. So the fame of Alexandria allowed these books to actually go to this new power in the East. And the first big arising of that power was in Baghdad. So this is an artist's depiction of the round city of Baghdad under rulers like Harun al-Rashid in the 700s and 800s AD. Harun al-Rashid is this famous ruler, inspiration for the Arabian 1001 Arabian Nights. This decadence, this wealth, but they were a bit like the Ptolemies. They gave lots of money and energy to scholars to come there and to collect books. It became incredibly fashionable and the thing to do for families of money, to collect books, to collect knowledge. And so from the Library of Alexandria, one of the centers of learning is in Baghdad, where many of the ancient Greek texts were sought after, like Ptolemy's Almagest and Euclid's Elements and Galen's medical works. These really important texts for the survival and thriving of a society were copied and disseminated out, again, from Baghdad. This is Harun al-Rashid and this old Islamic image showing men in a library studying with the scrolls behind them. Here's an Arab copying of the Elements by Euclid. So they also combined Indian and Hindu maths. And this isn't about the library so much. I just thought this was a really interesting insight that they brought in this new way of using numbers. So Euclid's system had different kinds of ways of using numbers. And you can see here from the Hindu culture, slowly through the Arabic and the medieval, we start to get the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. that we know, and which allowed maths to be done much more efficiently with these sets of 10 going up to infinity. Two different sects split in the Middle East, the Abbasid Caliphate and the Umayyad Caliphate. And the Umayyads were almost wiped out, but they fled to Spain in the 700s AD, which was a newly conquered Arab territory. And this is where a lot of these ancient texts came from the Middle East, which had been copied from the collections of the Library of Alexandria, and they came across to Spain, to the south of Spain, especially where these Muslim centers were. One of the most famous was Cordoba in the south of Spain, which you can still see today, this very ancient mosque, which was turned into a cathedral up here in the middle. But it has this strange mixture of a very Islamic mosque and then a cathedral in the middle of it. This was, again, in the same vein as Baghdad, and this stress on acquiring books, acquiring knowledge, studying these books, furthering one's knowledge, and copying these books. It passed into this Muslim Spain, which became one of the top centers of learning in the medieval period, when a lot of Western Europe, there really wasn't that much going on in terms of the furthering of science, but it was kept alive. These ancient writers like Euclid and Ptolemy, they were kept alive in these little tiny centers like Cordoba. Cordoba gave rise to two of the most famous, both Muslim, and also there was a Jewish philosopher, and Averroes up here, who was a polymath, so he studied lots of different things, and Maimonides. So these two guys, these two statues are in Cordoba still. They were instrumental, again, in translating these works from the ancient Greek into the Arabic and in passing on the flame. And then Toledo. So it's a very small little town in central Spain. And this was in between the Muslim territories in the south and the Christian territories in the north. And as the Islamic world got smaller in Spain and the Christians pushed down, many monks and scholars from all over Europe, they came to Toledo because Toledo still had a huge libraries from the Muslim influence, with texts, all kinds of texts, both Islamic scientific and philosophical texts, but also the ancient texts like the Euclids and the Ptolemies. So it became a real pilgrimage site for scholarship in the 1100s and the 1200s AD. One such scholar was Gerard of Cremona, who was an Italian translator who was on a mission to try and find a copy of Ptolemy's Almagest, the greatest book. And he went to Toledo, and there he learnt Arabic from scratch and translated Ptolemy from the Arabic into Latin, which then went into Europe. So this is about 900 years ago. Really amazing. All these little things that lead into the Renaissance and to this rebirth of all of these different strands of science and philosophy and knowledge. And another very important center was Venice in the 1400s, especially. It again attracted many of these books. Venice was a port city. It thrived on trade, especially maritime trade. And it was a natural center for all of these texts to come in. And again, it was a sign of one's cultured status to have a collection of books. And it's in Venice that two very important figures start up a new movement in the 1300s called humanism. So Petrarch, who was one of the earliest humanists, and also Poggio, who went around Europe collecting previously unknown texts that were hidden in libraries and monasteries from the past. And one of the key tenets of humanism was learning, literacy, and knowledge, something very Greek, very Aristotelian, at the very seeds of the Library of Alexandria, and being passed on through all these ages and then erupting again in the Renaissance. So yes, just to end with this image of the School of Athens in the Vatican by Raphael. Most of these people are Greek, but this turbaned figure is Averroes, this guy from Cordoba. He's one figure, one Muslim figure who actually, there should be many, many, many more, because they were instrumental in copying these ancient texts from these ancient Greek thinkers. many of whom lived or worked or studied at the Library of Alexandria and wrote books and passed on this knowledge. I wanted to end with the last two lines of this poem by Callimachus, because even though it's about a friend of his who died, but whose voice and whose poetry will survive forever, I find it quite a beautiful bit of poetry about the Library of Alexandria, about how the library has long gone, but the books will hopefully forever fly around. Aide te aids ousin andones, hersin hopanton harpactes aidos uk epigera vale. Still are thy pleasant voices, thy nightingales awake. For death he taketh all away, but them he cannot take.